This is the 15th episode in my series on how to write short stories. In this video article, we're going to look at the 5 steps of the minimum viable hero's journey, which was introduced in episode 14. The 5 steps of the minimum viable hero's journey, just to refresh your memory, are the implied ordinary world, the efficient call to adventure, which sets the stakes of the story as well, a distinct threshold crossing of some type, death and rebirth ordeal or a resurrection, and a reward, stroke seizing the sword, or return with the elixir. And which of those two you would choose would depend on whether your death and rebirth ordeal is the equivalent of step 8 of the long form hero's journey, which is the supreme ordeal, or step 11, which is the resurrection. So let's look at each of these in a little more detail, and then at the end of this video article I'll show you how you can use this to very quickly sketch out a story spine for a short story. So the implied ordinary world functions as the status quo at the story start, and because it's a short story, you don't have a lot of time to set the story, so you've really got to sketch out details and trust that the audience will intuit the big picture from the details that you've sketched out. You can establish this implied ordinary world through character, appearance, through behavior, or setting. So, for example, if you've got, and we'll see an example of like a pulp noir detective story, but if you open and there's a guy in an office in 1930s downtown New York, and he's obsessively chain smoking cigarettes, shuffling papers on his desk, and the sign on his on the window says Joe Bloggs, private investigator. From just those details, which you could sketch out in 3 or 4 lines, the audience will know this is a private investigator. He's not got any work at the moment, and maybe he's chain smoking because he's worried about money or something. There's maybe some anxiety in the background. So that's the kind of thing that this line means. Setting up the implied ordinary world doesn't require extensive exposition. In the last episode, we talked about Chris Vogler, or I gave Chris Vogler's quote where the ancients believed a complete dramatic unit could be communicated with a single image painted on the side of a piece of pottery, for example. And it's that kind of idea. And although as writers, we're not communicating in images per se, we're communicating with words. Those words are used to present an image. So often the images that you present can imply that they're not descriptions just to say what someone's wearing or whatever, but those descriptions can be used to purposefully imply what the ordinary world and what the ordinary scenario of the story is. The other function of the implied ordinary world is it contrasts with the rest of the story. So it gives you the status quo, and then the next step happens, which is the call to adventure, and then the story moves, and you get story contrast from where the story starts out to where the story ends up. So, and just mentioned the call to adventure. An efficient call to adventure is the second step of the MVHJ, and this call to adventure is not just a call to adventure, it establishes stakes and motivations of the principal characters. It also can be used to create a narrative problem that requires resolution, and it signals to the audience what's at stake in the story. And again, if you can compress this into the smallest narrative unit possible, so that could be a single image, it could be a line of dialogue, it could be the arrival of a letter or a telegram, or if you're in a more contemporary setting, I was thinking of the 1930s private investigator, but if you're in a more contemporary setting, it could be an email, it could be anything like that, and the call to adventure can do, if you construct it carefully, it can do several of those narrative tasks at once. So it launches the story, establishes the stakes, tells us what the narrative problem that needs to be solved is, and again, with short stories, every sentence has got to do double, triple duty if possible. So it's all about writing in a very lean style and communicating the different steps of the minimum viable hero's journey as concisely and succinctly as possible. Third step is a distinct threshold crossing. This represents the hero or protagonist. I'll just use the word the hero. When I use it, I mean it's the same thing as a protagonist. Doesn't have to be a hero in the epic sense, but the threshold crossing represents the hero committing to the challenge. It also represents movement from safety to risk, from stasis to movement as well. So the audience should feel a change in the narrative energy when this threshold crossing is made. Physical movements can be good to convey this. Crossing bridges, entering doorways, entering new buildings, entering suspicious buildings, things like that. And also the other way these physical movements, where you transition from one point to another, can work really nicely, is you can transition from something that represents the implied ordinary world to something that represents the special world of the story via this threshold crossing. So it also signals to the audience that there's a point of no return in the story and the hero is moving forwards. So that's the third step. The fourth step is the main part of the story. It's the death and rebirth ordeal or resurrection. This is the emotional and narrative centerpiece in many ways. There should be doubt about the hero's success. If we know the hero is going to succeed, then there's not much tension in the story. So there should be a legitimate element of doubt about whether the hero will succeed with the narrative problem that's raised by the call to adventure. The ordeal should test the hero's skills, values, and resolves as well. And it must threaten something meaningful. So death and rebirth doesn't necessarily mean physical death. It can mean identity of a character. It can mean the values the character holds. It can mean a relationship. So if you were writing, I think I mentioned this in the previous episode, if you're writing a romantic kind of short story, then the potential death and rebirth here might be the death of a relationship, or a death of love, something like that. So it's not the very obvious potential threat to life, although that sometimes can be in some genres. So you'll find it in horror, you'll find it in some thriller style short stories, potentially some kind of detective mystery type short stories. There's often a threat to life in those, but it's not always that. So when you see the words death and rebirth, you don't have to assume that relates to physical threat and physical death. It can relate on a more metaphorical level as well. And then the final stage is reward or return with the elixir. And which one this will be will depend on whether in the previous step you chose for the hero a supreme ordeal or a resurrection style scene. And if you went with a resurrection style scene, the supreme ordeal could possibly be something that happened earlier in the hero's backstory that's alluded to at some point in the story itself. But in this stage, this provides closure and meaning to the ordeal, meaning to the story. It demonstrates consequences of the hero's actions too. It can contain a thematic message or moral. Again, depending on what kind of short fiction you're writing. Some short fiction are just designed as little pieces of entertainment, which is fine. Some are designed to be a bit more profound than that. Whether you use a thematic message or a moral will depend on what you're writing. It can also function as a surprise reveal or confirmation of growth as well. And don't forget the different types of story that we looked at earlier in this series, as codified by Damon Knight: solution story, revelation story, resolution, etc., because they can colour all of these events as well. Maybe I'll do a video article on that in the future, although that's not what I'm planning in this series. So I'm going to give you a very quick example, couple of examples. So this is going to be sketching out a 5-step private investigator kind of noir kind of story using the minimum viable hero's journey. So step 1, you've got a struggling private investigator in his implied ordinary world. Step 2, client with a mysterious case appears. That's the call to adventure. Can also set up the stakes. The mysterious case might revolve around a murder or a blackmail or lots of money or a kidnapping, depending on quite what you're trying to, what you foresee for the story, what kind of story ending you want. The crossing the first threshold could be the private investigator comes across dangerous criminals who are involved in this mysterious case, and he's got 2 choices. Either he can basically back off and no longer take the case, which is kind of like a late refusal of the call, or he can go, no, I'm going to find out what happened, and then that's crossing from his safe world as a struggling private investigator and crossing a threshold into the story world where there's some potential dangers. And then there's a confrontation where perhaps our private investigator is nearly killed uncovering the truth. And then in the final step, he exposes the conspiracy and rebuilds reputation. So the reward there is he brings bad people or villains, whatever you want to call them, and I'm painting in very broad strokes. There is lots of room for much more detailed nuance if that's the kind of writer you are. For the purpose of demonstrating this 5-step minimum viable hero's journey, I'm painting in very broad strokes. So that's the reward he gets. He's exposed to conspiracy, which helps rebuild his reputation. So hopefully he's getting more work. And that's something that you could build into the implied ordinary world, that the reason he's struggling is because he took on a case, something happened, and his reputation has been shot as a result of that. So that when you're developing a story, you can organically cross-reference to earlier stages and build more detail in, foreshadow detail, so that by the time you get to the end, the ending seems a lot more logical, but not necessarily predictable. If you have a predictable ending, that's not really ideal. You want an ending that feels logical, but is done in a surprising manner. Let's do another quick example. This is a 5-step ghost story. So in the implied ordinary world, we've got a skeptical protagonist, doesn't believe in ghosts, doesn't believe in supernatural stuff. A supernatural intrusion of some description disrupts his normal life. That's the call to adventure. He's now got 2 choices. He can run away from that, or he can try and find out what this is and try and solve the problem. In the crossing the threshold, he actually encounters the supernatural intrusion, and he chooses to investigate rather than flee, which then becomes a point of no return and creates forward movement within the story. There's a direct confrontation with the supernatural force, and the resolution brings peace to the ghost, and he returns to the ordinary world with enhanced spiritual awareness. So that would be a return with the elixir rather than a reward / seizing the sword. So these are just very quick examples that I put together so you could see that on a high level you can use this concept of the 5-step hero's journey to create a story spine that hangs together that you can use to structure a short story. So in the next episode, we're actually going to look at an analysis of a Ray Bradbury story using the minimum variable hero's journey. I'm not sure what story I'm going to use, but I think it's going to be A Sound of Thunder, which is the story, if you don't know, famous Ray Bradbury story where a man goes back in time. It's an organised trip to shoot a dinosaur. Very clever story, and it gave rise to a thing known as the butterfly effect. You ever seen any time travel movies or read any time travel books? The classic example is the Stephen King book about the shooting of JFK, 11/22/63. They talk about the butterfly effect in that and even mention the story. If you've got any questions on what we've covered in this episode, drop me an email, paul@deliberate-practice.com. And if you're a frustrated or aspiring fiction writer, do check out my resource, The Writing Vault. I will put a link in the description of this video. You may find that that's something that meets your needs, but have a look at that. And if you've got any questions about that, use the email address and drop me an email. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video when we look at the Ray Bradbury story analysed with this minimum viable hero's journey.